The Great War, Meuse-Argonne, 1918. In the fall of 1918, World War I was reaching its brutal climax. Germany, drained by its failed spring offensives, was retreating under the Allied 100 Days Offensive. Into this storm stepped the American Expeditionary Force, an enormous but largely untested army. For the first time, the United States had cast off its isolationism to fight in a European war. General John J. Pershing, the AEF's commander, rejected calls to plug his troops into British and French units. He wanted to show the world and history that America could fight and win on its own terms. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was his proving ground. The goal was to break through the German defenses between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest and cut the Sedan-Mézeray Railroad, a vital supply artery. Its loss would cripple the German front, but the Germans knew it too. They had spent 4 years turning this 24-mile sector into the heart of the Hindenburg Line. It was layered with trench systems, concrete bunkers, and endless barbed wire, all embedded into rough terrain manned by hardened veterans. Over 1 million Americans would be thrown into this crucible. They were a product of rushed mobilization. They wore a wool uniform, a British-style Brodie helmet, and carried either a Springfield or an Enfield rifle. Much of their gear came from France, proof of how unprepared America's arms industry had been. At 2:30 a.m. on September 26, 1918, over 2,700 Allied guns unleashed one of the largest artillery barrages in history, firing more shells than both sides had used in the entire Civil War. 3 hours later, American infantry went over the top into a fog-shrouded hell. The 47-day battle was a meat grinder. Mud, rain, tangled forest, and steep ravines slowed the advance. Many American units were green and their commanders inexperienced. Air power and armor had little effect. It was trench fighting at close range. One episode came to define the nightmare: the Lost Battalion. In October, elements of the 77th Division pushed too far and were surrounded in a ravine. For 5 days, Major Charles Whittlesey's men fought off wave after wave of German attacks while starving and were fired upon by their own artillery. Of around 600 men, only around 190 emerged unscathed. The Meuse-Argonne was a victory, but a costly one. Over 120,000 casualties, including 26,000 dead, made it the bloodiest campaign in US history. Yet it marked the arrival of the United States as a modern military power. The AEF had proven itself in independent combat. Lessons in logistics, combined arms warfare, and command would shape the doctrine of World War II. The American soldier had stepped onto the world stage. The European Theatre, D-Day, Normandy, 1944. By mid-1944, Germany's defeat was inevitable, but far from imminent. While Soviet forces crushed the Wehrmacht in the east and Allied armies pushed up from Italy, the pressure was mounting to open a second front from Western Europe. That moment came on June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord. It was the most ambitious military operation in history. 5 Allied divisions crossing the Channel to storm a 50-mile trench of the Normandy coast. The goal was to pour millions of men and mountains of supplies into France and drive straight to the heart of Hitler's empire. Before dawn, paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped behind enemy lines, seizing bridges and disrupting German communications despite a chaotic, scattered drop. At first light, thousands of Allied naval guns unleashed a thunderous bombardment. Then came the landings. The bloodiest was at Omaha Beach. The plan unraveled almost immediately. Naval and air bombardments missed their marks, leaving German defenses, manned by the battle-hardened 352nd Division, largely intact. Amphibious tanks sank in rough seas, and the first waves of American infantry were cut down on the sand, pinned in a deadly crossfire. The invasion teetered on the brink of failure. What saved it was the grit and improvisation of small units. Junior officers and NCOs pushed forward. Men like Brigadier General Norman Coda urged soldiers to breach barbed wire with Bangalore torpedoes and flank machine gun nests. One by one, the pillboxes fell. By midday, Americans had clawed their way up the bluffs and seized a fragile but critical foothold on bloody Omaha. By nightfall, the Allies were ashore and they would not be pushed back. D-Day cost roughly 10,000 Allied casualties, including over 4,400 dead. American forces bore the brunt at Omaha with over 2,500 casualties. But the landing succeeded. It shattered the Atlantic Wall and opened the road to Paris and eventually Berlin. For the United States, D-Day became the defining moment of the Second World War, a symbol of resolve, sacrifice, and leadership. The success of D-Day solidified America's role as the senior partner in the Western Alliance and set the stage for the post-war world order, including NATO and decades of US global leadership. The Pacific Theater, Iwo Jima, 1945. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island barely 8 square miles in size, sat halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Its airfields made it vital. Under Japanese control, it warned the mainland of incoming B-29 raids and launched fighters to harass them. In American hands, however, it could host P-51 escorts and serve as an emergency landing site for damaged bombers. The island had to be taken, and so Operation Detachment was born. Iwo Jima's defense was commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a brilliant strategist. Knowing he couldn't stop the invasion, he aimed to bleed the Americans so heavily that they'd think twice about invading Japan itself. Rather than fight at the beaches, he turned Iwo Jima into a fortress, over 1,000 pillboxes, bunkers, and artillery nests connected by 11 miles of tunnels. His 21,000 men were buried in hardened positions, waiting to strike. On February 19, 1945, after 74 days of pre-bombardment, Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions stormed the beaches. At first, it seemed the bombardment had worked. They landed on an empty and quiet beach, but Kuribayashi was waiting. Once the beaches were jammed with men and vehicles, the trap was sprung. Mortars, artillery, and machine guns opened up from hidden strongpoints, many high on Mount Suribachi. The volcanic ash bogged down vehicles and men alike. Progress was brutal and slow, measured in yards. Marines fought from crater to crater, clearing bunkers with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition charges. There was no front line, only endless close combat against an enemy that refused to retreat. The most iconic moment came on February 23. After days of vicious fighting, a patrol from the 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag. Cheers erupted across the island and at sea. Hours later, a larger flag was raised and captured in Joe Rosenthal's legendary photograph. But the battle was far from over. The worst fighting still still lay ahead in the island's northern sector, a hellscape the Marines called the Meat Grinder. The battle ended on March 26, 1945. It was an American victory, but a costly one. Over 26,000 US casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. Only 216 of Kuribayashi's men survived. Iwo Jima was the only Pacific battle where American casualties outnumbered Japanese. The captured airfields proved valuable though. Over 2,200 B-29s carrying nearly 25,000 airmen made emergency landings there. But as a fighter base, its impact was less decisive. Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa, showed just how fiercely Japan would defend its home islands. The anticipated toll of a mainland invasion, shaped by the carnage on Iwo Jima, played a critical role in Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb. The Korean War, Chosin Reservoir, 1950. By late 1950, the Korean War looked close to ending. General Douglas MacArthur's daring landing at Incheon had shattered North Korean forces, and UN troops were surging deep into the north. The mission had shifted from defense to reunification. But success masked a fatal blind spot: China. Despite repeated warnings, US commanders dismissed the threat of intervention. As the 1st Marine Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division advanced toward the Chosin Reservoir, they unknowingly marched into a trap. In secret, Mao Zedong had sent 120,000 Chinese troops across the Yalu River. They infiltrated the Taebaek Mountains, surrounding the narrow mountainous supply route that supported the advancing Americans. Then came the deep freeze. Temperatures plunged to -36 degrees Fahrenheit or -38 degrees Celsius. Marines were pushing forward, overstretched and exposed, unaware they were being hunted. Many Americans at the time were still using World War II era gear, armed with weapons that jammed in the cold. Medics carried morphine syrettes in their mouths to keep them from freezing. Even food rations had to be hacked apart with bayonets. Then, on the night of November 27th, the Chinese struck. Tens of thousands of white-clad soldiers launched coordinated nighttime assaults, announced by whistles, cymbals, and bugles. UN positions were hit from all sides. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, chaotic, and relentless. Cut off and surrounded, 30,000 US troops began a 78-mile fighting withdrawal toward the coast at Hungnam. Every mile was a battle, through ambushes, blizzards, and roadblocks. At Funchilin Pass, a destroyed bridge threatened to trap them for good, but in a daring airlift, 8 massive bridge sections were dropped by C-119s and assembled under fire, allowing the column to push through. The breakout was a tactical success against impossible odds. The 1st Marine Division successfully pulled back while inflicting devastating losses on the Chinese. UN casualties totaled over 17,000, including 4,000 dead or missing. Chinese losses may have exceeded 50,000, many of them frozen in place. But the shock of China's intervention and the collapse of the Home by Christmas offensive shattered morale. Public support for the war nosedived. By early 1951, 2/3 of Americans wanted out. Chosin exposed failures in intelligence, logistics, and leadership, but it also showcased extraordinary grit. The Chosin few became legends, a brotherhood forged in ice, blood, and fire. For many, it remains the defining battle of the Korean War, the moment America realized this wasn't going to be a quick war, but a long, grinding conflict. Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive, 1968. By late 1967, the Vietnam War had settled into a bloody stalemate. Nearly 500,000 American troops were deployed, and General Westmoreland's Success Offensive painted a picture of steady progress. The message from Washington? The enemy was weakening and victory was in sight. In Hanoi, however, the view was different. North Vietnamese leaders knew they couldn't outgun the US in a war of attrition, so they gambled everything on a bold strategy: a nationwide general offensive, general uprising. The goal was to shock America into pulling out by proving that, even in secure areas, the enemy could strike at will. They chose the perfect moment: Tet, the Lunar New Year. Though US intelligence had detected signs, it failed to grasp the scale of what was coming. The average US soldier in 1968 was outfitted for jungle patrols, olive fatigues, an M16, and support from helicopters and air power. Most were trained to fight in rural terrain, but that changed overnight. In the early hours of January 30th to 31st, some 84,000 NVA and Viet Cong fighters launched simultaneous attacks on over 100 cities and bases across South Vietnam. Suddenly, the war was in cities which were previously thought safe. Army cooks, clerks, and mechanics found themselves in gunfights on base perimeters, in alleyways, and even in Saigon's streets. The most shocking moment, though, was the attack on the US Embassy in Saigon. A VC sapper team breached the wall and fought inside the embassy compound for 6 hours. They were pushed back, but the illusion of control was shattered. Then came the Battle of Hue. Communist forces seized the historic imperial capital and held it for nearly a month. The fighting was house to house, street by street. When it was over, thousands of civilians had been executed by the occupiers and buried in mass graves. But the offensive's true power was measured in images. Televised firefights, burning cities, the famous photo of a VC prisoner being executed in the street. It all undercut the story of progress Americans had been told for years. Tet was ultimately a disaster for the communists. They failed to spark a popular uprising, lost every major battle, and suffered staggering casualties of up to 50,000 dead. The Viet Cong never recovered. But strategically, Hanoi won. Tet exposed the truth. The US wasn't winning. It tore up the credibility gap between Washington and the American people. The myth of progress was gone, replaced by footage of chaos and shock. Public support collapsed, protests exploded, and on March 31st, President Lyndon Johnson halted the bombing in the north and announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Tet ended America's will to win the Vietnam War. From that moment on, the question was no longer how to achieve victory, but how to get out. The Hostage Crisis, Operation Eagle Claw, 1980. On November 4th, 1979, the US entered a crisis that would last for 444 days. Iranian militants stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking 52 hostages. It was a direct challenge to US power, fueled by anger over decades of American support for the recently ousted Shah. For months, President Jimmy Carter pursued diplomacy, but as the crisis dragged on and election season approached, pressure mounted. In April 1980, with talks stalled, he authorized a daring military rescue, Operation Eagle Claw. The plan was ambitious. Delta Force would infiltrate Tehran, storm the embassy, and extract the hostages from a captured airfield. The mission required a complex, multi-branch operation. Navy helicopters would rendezvous with Air Force C-130s at a desert staging area deep inside Iran. From there, the team would stage the rescue the following night. It was America's first attempt at a modern special ops raid. It had to go perfectly. On April 24th, 1980, the mission launched and began unraveling almost immediately. A massive dust storm, a haboob, disorientated the helicopter crews. One chopper turned back due to rotor damage, another lost its instruments, while a third suffered hydraulic failure. By the time the remaining aircraft reached Desert 1, only 5 helicopters were flight-worthy, one fewer than required. Then, things got worse. A civilian bus stumbled onto the site. Moments later, a fuel truck ignored warnings and was blown up by rangers, lighting the desert sky. Secrecy was gone. The mission was over and the Americans started to withdraw, but in the darkness and blowing sand, one RH-53D helicopter collided with an EC-130 full of fuel and troops. The explosion was catastrophic. Both aircraft were destroyed and 8 Americans were killed. The survivors evacuated in the remaining C-130s, leaving behind the helicopters' classified gear and their fallen comrades in the Iranian desert. Operation Eagle Claw was a disaster. No hostages rescued, 8 men dead, and the global humiliation of a superpower stumbling on the world stage. But out of failure came transformation. The Holloway report exposed a system in disarray with poor coordination, an unclear command structure, a lack of joint training, and ill-suited equipment. The fallout led to sweeping reforms. The Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986 unified military command structures. More crucially, US Special Operations Command was created in 1987, giving America's elite forces the ability to train, plan, and operate together like never before. Eagle Claw is often called the most successful failure in US military history because it directly led to the birth of the modern Special Operations Forces, units that would go on to redefine American warfare in the 21st century. The Perfect Storm, the air campaign of Desert Storm 1991. On August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded Kuwait, an oil-rich US ally, triggering a major international crisis. Iraq's aggression threatened both the Middle East and global energy security. The response from the US and its allies was swift. Under President George H.W. Bush, Operation Desert Shield deployed over 500,000 American troops to Saudi Arabia to deter further Iraqi advancements. When diplomacy failed, Operation Desert Storm was authorized, one of the largest military coalitions ever assembled, with 35 nations preparing to eject Iraq by force. The US military of 1991 was a different beast than it had been in Vietnam. Rebuilt after that war and after the failure at Desert 1, it was now a precision force, backed by Cold War-era tech and doctrine. At the heart of the campaign was a radical idea: win the war in the air before a single soldier crossed the line. Colonel John Warden's Instant Thunder Plan aimed to cripple Iraq by targeting 5 critical rings: leadership, infrastructure, essential services, the military, and public will. The objective was system paralysis, rendering Iraq unable to fight before the ground war began. At 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, the air war began. US Army Apaches destroyed Iraqi radar sites, opening the door for the main strike. Moments later, stealth F-117 Nighthawks struck command centers in Baghdad, followed by a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from Navy ships in the Gulf. What followed was one of the most intense air campaigns in history. Over 43 days, the coalition flew more than 116,000 sorties, dropping nearly 89,000 tons of bombs. Iraq's air defenses, once considered formidable, collapsed under electronic warfare, precision strikes, and relentless pressure. Many of Iraq's jets fled to Iran, never to return. The star of the show was precision-guided munitions. Americans watched missiles fly into air shafts and bunker doors in eerie green night vision, broadcast live on CNN. It was warfare as spectacle, earning the nickname the video game war. Behind the precision was massive, old-school bombardment. B-52s carpet-bombed entrenched Iraqi Republican Guard units, setting the stage for the ground assaults which began on February 24th. Iraqi defenses crumbled almost immediately. Within 100 hours, Kuwait was liberated. Coalition casualties were astonishingly low. 292 total deaths, only 147 from enemy fire. Desert Storm proved that air power, when combined with modern tech, could dominate a conventional war. Stealth, GPS, satellite intelligence, and real-time battlefield coordination had redefined what war looked like. The swift, clean victory helped erase the Vietnam Syndrome, the post-war hesitance to commit US troops abroad. The success of Desert Storm renewed American faith in its military and confirmed its status as the lone global superpower. But the spectacle of the clean war also obscured the real costs of conflict, setting the stage for deeper US involvement in the Middle East in the years ahead. Black Hawk Down, the Battle of Mogadishu, 1993. In 1992, Somalia was collapsing. Civil war and famine had killed over 300,000 people. The US and the UN launched a humanitarian intervention, Operation Restore Hope, to secure food supplies and stabilize the country. At first, it worked, but politics got messy. As UN forces shifted toward nation building, they clashed with local warlords, especially Mohammed Farah Adid, a powerful militia leader who saw foreign troops as occupiers. When a June ambush killed 24 Pakistani peacekeepers, the US declared Adid a target. What began as famine relief spiraled into a manhunt. In August 1993, Task Force Ranger, composed of Delta Force, US Army Rangers, and 160th SOAR helicopter crews, arrived in Mogadishu with one mission: capture Adid and dismantle his network. On October 3rd, 1993, they launched a raid to capture 2 of his top lieutenants. It was supposed to last an hour. The assault began in broad daylight. Rangers fast roped onto a building in central Mogadishu while Delta operators stormed it from the ground. Within minutes, the targets were in custody. Then, everything fell apart. A Black Hawk helicopter, call sign Super 61, was hit by an RPG and crashed. A rescue force was dispatched, but then a second chopper, Super 64, went down. US forces were now trapped in the heart of a hostile city under constant fire from thousands of armed Somali militia and civilians. The narrow streets made vehicle movement nearly impossible. Coordination broke down. Ammunition and water ran low. The fight, originally planned to last 60 minutes, stretched into an 18-hour urban battle. 2 Delta snipers, MSG Gary Gordon and SFC Randy Shughart, volunteered to defend the crew of the second down Black Hawk. They fought to the death. Both were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. By nightfall, a convoy of UN troops mounted a rescue. The surviving Rangers and Delta operators, many wounded and carrying their dead, fought their way to safety. The toll was staggering. 18 Americans killed, over 70 wounded. Hundreds of Somalis died. Images of dead American soldiers dragged through the streets of Mogadishu shocked the world and enraged the US public. President Clinton pulled out US forces within months. The UN mission collapsed soon after. For many Americans, Mogadishu marked the end of humanitarian interventionism and the beginning of a more cautious foreign policy. It was a wake-up call. The battle exposed flaws in communication, coordination, and planning. The legacy of Mogadishu shaped the next generation of US special operations. The hard lessons learned there would echo into the 2000s, into Iraq, Afghanistan, and the mountains of Pakistan. The Serpent's Bite, Operation Anaconda, 2002. By early 2002, the Taliban regime had fallen and Al-Qaeda's network in Afghanistan was fractured. But many of its fighters, including high-ranking leaders, had escaped the Battle of Tora Bora and regrouped in the rugged Shah-e-Kot Valley near the Pakistani border. US intelligence believed around 150 to 200 enemy fighters were dug in. In response, planners launched Operation Anaconda, a hammer and anvil assault to trap and destroy Al-Qaeda remnants. Afghan militias with US Special Forces would push from the west, while troops from the 101st Airborne and 10th Mountain Division would helicopter into blocking positions on the eastern ridges. It was meant to be a swift, crushing blow, America's first large-scale conventional battle of the war. But intelligence was badly off. The valley held closer to 1,000 well-armed fighters, many from Al-Qaeda and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. The terrain favored them, the planning was rushed, air-ground coordination was poor, and the US forces were walking into a hornet's nest. On March 2nd, 2002, the operation began and fell apart almost instantly. The Afghan Hammer Force was ambushed early and pinned down, effectively neutralized. But the US Anvil element went ahead anyway. As CH-47 Chinooks carrying American infantry approached their landing zones, they were met with heavy machine guns, mortars, and RPGs. One Chinook was hit and crash-landed. The troops found themselves trapped in a deep ravine, later called Hell's Halfpipe, under relentless fire from fortified enemy positions above. Then, on March 4th, a Navy SEAL team, call sign Mako 30, attempted to insert on Takwa Gar, a 10,000-foot peak, to set up an overwatch position. Their Chinook was ambushed. In the chaos, Petty Officer Neil Roberts fell from the helicopter into the snow-covered mountain, landing alone in the middle of an enemy stronghold. The effort to recover him turned into a 17-hour firefight, later known as Roberts Ridge. 2 more helicopters were shot down. 6 more Americans were killed, including Air Force Combat Controller John Chapman, who fought on alone after initially being presumed dead. His heroism captured on drone footage. Operation Anaconda officially ended on March 18th. Hundreds of enemy fighters were killed and the Shah-e-Kot Valley was cleared. But it came at a cost of 8 Americans killed, 82 wounded, the highest casualties of any single engagement in the war up to that point. The battle exposed deep flaws in joint operations, poor intelligence, fractured command, and lack of coordination between SOF, conventional troops, and air support. After-action reports triggered sweeping changes in how US forces planned and executed joint combat missions. Anaconda showed that Al-Qaeda and its allies were still capable and willing to die for their cause. The Long War, America's longest war, was only beginning. The Phantom Fury, Second Battle of Fallujah, 2004. By late 2004, the Iraq War had shifted into a brutal insurgency. Fallujah, a city in the Sunni-dominated Al-Anbar province, had become the heart of the resistance. After the first Battle of Fallujah in April, the city was handed over to local forces who quickly lost control. Fallujah became a sanctuary for insurgents, including foreign fighters and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. From this base, insurgents launched attacks across Iraq, staged propaganda executions, and directly threatened Iraq's political transition. With national elections approaching in January 2005, the coalition couldn't allow Fallujah to remain in enemy hands. The enemy had spent months fortifying it, planting IEDs, digging tunnels, rigging buildings, and preparing for a siege. US commanders anticipated a long and bloody fight. The US Marine of 2004 was equipped for war. Digital camo, body armor, an M16A4 with ACOG backed by tanks, artillery, and air support. Operation Phantom Fury launched on November 7th with cordons, leaflet drops, and evacuation warnings. Most of the city's 300,000 civilians fled, leaving behind a garrison of die-hard insurgents. On November 8th, after a massive bombardment, 14,000 coalition troops began their assault from the north. The battle quickly became the most intense urban combat of US forces since Wei in Vietnam. Clearing Fallujah meant house-to-house warfare. Insurgents ambushed from bunkers and tunnels using RPGs and small arms before vanishing through mouse holes between buildings. US forces countered with overwhelming firepower, blowing through walls instead of using doors, firing tank rounds into buildings, and calling in AC-130 gunships and airstrikes with surgical precision. On November 13th, in the now infamous House of Hell, a squad from 3rd Battalion 1st Marines was ambushed inside. First Sergeant Brad Cassell shot 7 times, shielded a wounded Marine from a grenade blast with his own body. The photo of Cassell, bleeding but alert, being carried from the house with pistol in hand, became one of the most iconic images of the Iraq War. By December 23rd, Fallujah was officially cleared. Around 1,500 insurgents were killed, another 1,500 captured. But the price was high. 95 US troops and 8 Iraqi soldiers killed, over 600 Americans wounded, and much of the city reduced to rubble. The battle became a textbook case for urban warfare. It showed the necessity of combined arms planning, air-ground coordination, and decisive conventional force, even in a counterinsurgency. The integration of Iraqi forces was also a crucial step in building local security capacity. Phantom Fury succeeded as it enabled the 2005 elections to proceed, but it came with a heavy cost. The destruction, captured by embedded journalists, fueled anti-American sentiment and intensified debates in the US over the war's direction. For those who fought there, Fallujah became their Iwo Jima, a symbol of sacrifice, grit, and the harsh reality of modern urban warfare. The longest hunt, Operation Neptune Spear, 2011. For a decade after 9/11, one man symbolized America's war on terror, Osama bin Laden. After vanishing from Tora Bora in 2001, the trail went cold until US intelligence tracked one of his trusted couriers, Abu Ahmad al-Kuwaiti, to an unusual compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, in August 2010. It had high walls, the occupants burned their trash, and they had no phone lines. It all pointed to something or someone. There was no hard proof bin Laden was inside, but the circumstantial evidence was strong. After months of surveillance and tense debate, President Obama authorized a bold plan, a surgical raid by US Special Forces. The assault force consisted of hand-picked members of Red Squadron SEAL Team 6. Their gear included HK-416 carbines, suppressed sidearms, and night vision. They'd be flown in by 2 stealth-modified Black Hawk helicopters piloted by the 116th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. On the night of May 1st, 2011, the helicopters lifted off from Afghanistan. Flying low through Pakistani airspace, they approached the compound undetected until the lead chopper ran into unexpected airflow, crash landing inside the compound. No one was seriously hurt, and the SEALs launched the assault. They cleared the compound methodically. In the guest house, they killed the courier and his brother. On the 2nd floor, they shot bin Laden's son, Khalid. Then on the 3rd floor, they found Osama bin Laden, armed or not, accounts vary, and killed him. Over the radio came the confirmation. For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo. In just 40 minutes, the SEALs secured intelligence, prepped the body, destroyed the downed helicopter, and exfiltrated aboard a backup Chinook. Operation Neptune Spear was a flawless tactical success. The raid marked the culmination of a decade-long evolution in American special operations, fusing elite troops, real-time intel, and surgical precision into one lethal package. It was the legacy of everything learned since Eagle Claw. The intel recovered from the compound yielded insights into Al-Qaeda's operations and structure. But more than that, the raid delivered something intangible: closure. The news sparked spontaneous celebrations across the US, from the White House gates to Ground Zero. It didn't end the war on terror, but it shattered Al-Qaeda's aura of invincibility and showed the world that America doesn't forget. The Shadow War, the Battle of Khasham, 2018. By early 2018, the Syrian civil war had morphed into a chaotic proxy conflict. On one side, US Special Operations Forces partnered with the Syrian Democratic Forces to eliminate ISIS. On the other, Russian-backed regime forces, including regular troops and Wagner Group mercenaries, supporting the Assad regime. To avoid direct conflicts, both sides agreed to a de-escalation line along the Euphrates River. US and SDF forces to the east, Assad's forces to the west. But that fragile arrangement was tested near Deir ez-Zor, where a key natural gas facility, the Conoco plant, sat in SDF hands, protected by a small US SOF team. On February 7th, 2018, a large pro-regime force, about 500 fighters, including Russian mercenaries, tanks, artillery, and APCs, began moving to seize the plant. US commanders warned Russia multiple times via the hotline, and the answer was always the same: no Russian troops involved, not our fight. The American presence at Conoco was tiny, around 40 operators, mostly Delta Force and Green Berets, with Marine support and local SDF fighters. They had armored trucks, javelins, and heavy weapons, but their greatest strength was above them: absolute air dominance. At 10 PM, the enemy opened fire, shelling the plant and advancing with armor. Heavily outnumbered, the Americans returned fire and called in the full weight of US air power. HIMARS rockets and artillery struck first. Then came the aircraft. F-15Es, F-22 Raptors, B-52s, and AC-130 gunships pounded the enemy from above. Apaches and Reaper drones hunted the survivors across open ground. For nearly 4 hours, the pro-regime column was systematically destroyed. The outcome was overwhelming. Between 200 and 300 enemy fighters killed, many of them Wagner mercenaries. 0 American casualties. 1 SDF fighter wounded. Khasham was a live fire demonstration of what modern US warfare looks like. A handful of elite operators, networked into satellites, drones, and jets, had obliterated a battalion-sized force without breaking a sweat. Khasham marked the first direct clash between US troops and Russian nationals since the Cold War. Moscow denied responsibility, calling the fighters volunteers, but the message had been sent. Inside military circles, it was studied as a preview of what a near-peer conflict might look like. It also revealed the future of warfare: grey zone conflicts fought by proxies, mercenaries, and deniable forces, where the lines of war and peace blur. From muddy trenches to desert skies, from Omaha Beach to the backstreets of Fallujah, the American way of war has never stood still. Each fight, won, lost, or somewhere in between, pushed the military to adapt, to rethink, to evolve. But for all the technology and doctrine, the story is still the same. Young Americans sent to fight battles that reshape not only distant lands, but their own countries too. 100 years of change, 100 years of lessons, and through it all, the same truth. War never stops remaking the nation that wages it. But what do you think? Which of these battles left the deepest mark on America's place in history? Do today's precision raids carry the same weight as the mass battles of the past? And what lessons should America carry forward into the wars of tomorrow? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.